Thank you. So first of all, I'd like to thank the University of Roma Tre and especially Margherita for inviting me in this conference, to take part in this conference. I'm extremely pleased to be part of this very qualified panel, but honestly, I feel miserable to intervene after Philip's musical presentation. So I'm really tempted to change the title. I mean, starting quoting Bob Dylan and says 67, so it's a precise quotation, so times there are a-changing. So the title could be appropriate to my presentation. I mean, some weeks ago, just a few days before the flood, I spent a couple of days in Venice visiting the Biennale. As some of you probably know, this year the exhibition title was May You Live in Interesting Times. I can certainly argue that the antitrust community is actually living interesting times, and I say this aware of the ambiguity of the quotation suspended in the middle ground between a wish and a Confucian course. If we consider that in the last 5 years, if we consider that in the last 5 years, the European Commission has concluded that the highest number of 102 cases ever reached and has imposed fines for over 8 billion euro, if not interesting, the times must be quite special. Also because after such an effort, the market power of the big tech seems to be the same, and new competitors are certainly not yet in the sight. So we have to ask ourselves why. Is it a question of deterrence? Is it too late for an ex post intervention? Do competition authorities need new tools? I mean, as you probably know, and we have listened to from the last intervention, some national competition laws are under revisions, not only the German one, but also the British one. Some of the reports recently published and already mentioned, so the Kremer, the Furman, the Stigler reports, call for more regulation and even from new agencies. We have seen how the German approach, reflected the threat of a digital unit. So the backstage explained a lot more than the real case concerning Facebook. They had to react somehow to a threat of a new governance of the digital sector. And even the Belgium, the Dutch, and the Luxembourg competition authorities proposed to include in competition law ex-ante tools in the competition laws, so tailor-made ex-ante tools. So in this perspective, the Italian Competition Authority, too, is living interesting times. And in my brief presentation, I'll try to provide a broad picture of what my agency has been doing to deal with the new challenges raised by the digital economy, at least using all the tools at our disposal, which is not only antitrust, but also consumer protection, to reach a better understanding about what's going on. And I'll conclude, possibly, we didn't cooperate before this conference, advocating for a broader competition policy, which means not really industrial policy, but the need for public policies market-friendly that can support the application of competition law in these interesting times. So this is the slide concerning the Commission's cases. And let's move to the big picture. So, in these recent years, as I said, we try to exploit all the tools at our disposals in order to have a better understanding of the digital, so-called digital revolution. So we had a lot of intervention in the enforcement activity, the advocacy activity, but also in consumer protection. So starting from the antitrust enforcement, which is still the core of our agency, in the past, they have been already mentioned, we really concluded a case concerning Booking and Expedia, an investigation into price parity clauses. I think that Andrea afterwards will go into details in the pros and cons of price parity clauses, and even in a follow-up ex post analysis. This is an important case also because, I mean, stressed how these issues have to be faced, have to be addressed within an international cooperative environment. I mean, we concluded the case, and the decision was the same, cooperating with the French and the Swedish competition authorities. I mean, obtaining commitments which reduce the scope of the price parity clauses, I mean, and confining them just to a so-called narrow price parity clauses. Unfortunately, the Italian legislator intervened, and even such a pro-competitive result was undermined. Another sector where we had some cases which, at least indirectly, concerned the digital economy was the taxi services sector, where we had a number of investigations, some of them already decided, some other not yet, concerning exclusivity clauses included in the agreements governing the relationship between taxi dispatch services and taxi drivers. To be more concrete, I mean, all these clauses were aimed at impeding or at delaying or let's say obstacling the entry of a new app at that time called My Taxi and now Free Now, which was considered a threat for the so-called competitive equilibrium of the industry. I mean, the other two cases, but I mean, Inge, before my intervention, was much more was much clearer, and from my point of view, I cannot say much because they are still ongoing, but there are the two cases ongoing, the one concerning Amazon, so the suspected discrimination on Amazon's marketplace in favor of third-party sellers that use Amazon's logistics services. So somehow a self-precedent case, but we'll see which will be the final shape of the case at the end of the story. The other one is the one concerning the Google and the Android system and alleged refusal to supply access to Android Auto platform to the app NLX Recharge, which is not only provide the same services provided by the Maps, Google Maps, but also the possibility to book the recharge for the electric car. So something else, something more innovative than the traditional Google Maps. But, I mean, as even Margherita said in her introduction, we used consumer protection tools to deal with some of the concerns that we had about WhatsApp and Facebook. And in the WhatsApp case, de facto, WhatsApp forced the users to its service, WhatsApp Messenger, to accept in full the new terms of use and specifically the provision to share their personal data with Facebook. And in the Facebook case, in a way, a twin of the German one, we decided that since, I mean, we had another tool, we preferred to use the consumer protection tool because it is more flexible, and from our point of view, it seemed to be more appropriate to deal with the same problem, with the same issue. I mean, in a way, we had also a quite rapid outcome, which it is not particularly different from the final outcome that the German approach could reach at the end of the abuse case. And finally, again, it is ongoing. There is still a problem with Booking.com concerning pricing, ranking, and discount. But again, it is an ongoing investigation, and I cannot say more. But we were, I mean, the core of our better understanding effort was a a really tiring effort that I hope is very close to the conclusion. It is the market inquiry concerning big data. The distinctive feature of our effort, which doesn't want to be compared with much more academically sophisticated report like the reports mentioned by the other speakers. It is the attempt to do such an effort with the Data Protection Agency and with the communication regulator. Again, I mean, I am tempted to risk another musical quotation, but just dedicated to the Italian public. It is No, the triangle No. It is a pop singer, a trash pop singer called Renato Zero. And in this case, I have to argue, yes, the triangle, yes, because I mean, I hope it has been worth working together in order to mix the different, and I guarantee sometimes very different perspectives of the Antitrust Agency, the Data Protection Agency, and the the regulator in the communication industry. So the three authorities, we had a dual competence, so the antitrust and consumer protection. The telecom media regulator is mainly focused on media pluralism, and the data protection authority is focused on the privacy issue. So the implications of the digital economy for big data, for privacy regulation, antitrust, and consumer protection, in order to have a better understanding of the awareness of the characteristics and complexities of the digital economy, the objectives of the three authorities tend to be almost inevitably intertwined. Complex relationships between competition, privacy, and online pluralism require close and ongoing institutional cooperation. I mean, which is an effort which is worth doing, but again, I underline, I stress it, it's an effort. And there is a constant interaction among the three independent authorities, which is necessary to identify and reconcile possible trade-off between their tools and objectives. Again, because as we will see, and I mean, some of the, let's say, let's move in a more orderly way. We concluded two interim reports. We had some common policy recommendations, and I'll talk about them in a while, and in a few weeks' time there will be finally the final report. So the key issues, let's say, from our point of view, mainly from the antitrust point of view, I mean, nothing new. I mean, the other reports possibly wrote better pages on these issues, but I mean, again, some concrete evidence, since I mean, Phillips correctly stressed that evidence matter hashtag, something like that. They concern big data, market structure and barriers to entry, big data and market power, the relationship between personal data and competition, which is very, very, very crucial, at least in our sector inquiry, and some concerns concerning data-driven conducts, consumer protection, and antitrust. I mean, the bullets that you can see on the screen are quite traditional and nothing new. So the key role of big data across industries. Again, I mean, the proposals for the revision, for the new proposals for the German law evoke, in a way, the fact that, I mean, because of the role played by data, I mean, the conglomerate power, which is not that distant from the paramount power, the paramount significance for competition beyond the scope of one market or across markets or something like that. I mean, in a way, it is determined because of the role which can be played by the data, which is not the simple traditional leverage effect, but because of the data you can arrive also at, let's say, disrupting a relatively distant market from the market from where you are clearly dominant. But moving to another one, a quite original, also quite clear evidence that we achieved within the during the sector inquiry was, I mean, the new forms of market power. Because, I mean, it emerged quite a paradox. Most of the players that we heard during the sector inquiry argued that the dominant players were outside the market. So quite a paradox. I mean, the dominant player is not in the relevant market, but it is just beyond the relevant market because, I mean, because of the control of big data, they could enter easily in any markets and disrupt any market quite easily. I mean, it seems a paradox because in a way, using traditional lens, you can say, I mean, it's nothing more than an aggressive potential competitors. I mean, possibly we are, let's say, old-fashioned, but I mean, you can look at the same issue just being concerned of potential competition. But there is also a bit of truth in it. And this bit of truth, I mean, it is linked with the new characteristics of market power determined by the characteristics of digital platforms and the role played by data. I mean, just moving on the other side, I mean, there was a large consensus that big data are not essential facilities. It's very rare that they could play the role of that typical essential facility, that they are rarely barriers to entry. It depends on case by case, but I mean, overall, the results are moving in that direction. Whereas, I mean, there is much more lively outcome, there are much more lively results as far as the new forms of market power are concerned. I mean, Phillips in his fantastic presentation stressed that, I mean, the hipster antitrust is stressing, I mean, it's stressing the fact that market power is something else, it's just economic power. It's the typical hipster approach, which doesn't provide sufficient, from my point of view, legal certainty. But I mean, it is not a new issue. I mean, the problem of defining market power, or if it is just bargaining power, if it is something more, just economic power, it's an old story for antitrust law. Quite important, quite interesting, but again, nothing particularly original, but it is original the way we related with our cousin, the Data Protection Agency, is the not unilateral relationship between privacy and antitrust, between privacy and consumer welfare, between privacy and competition. So, I mean, the less the privacy, quite often, the higher, the lower privacy, the higher consumer welfare, the higher innovation, and possibly higher competition. So this strange relationship has to be taken into consideration when we have to balance the trade-off between data protection on one side and competition on the other side. But here I can just open a bracket, which is not included in the sector inquiry. I really appreciated an article by Nobel Prize Romer in 2018, when he stressed that, okay, there is a individual consumer welfare might be enhanced by reduction in data protection, and often it occurs, it happens, but if individual consumer welfare might increase, I mean, social consumer welfare, like in the case of pollution, could be much, much lower. So there is a problem that hasn't to be addressed using traditional antitrust tools, but possibly fiscal tools, possibly fiscal public policy. like when we deal with pollution. At the individual level, pollution might be not a problem, and you can be better off even with a higher and increasing level of pollution, because you can have lower prices, you can have. So at the individual level, consumer welfare, especially if consumer welfare, and I fully agree with what Philip said in his presentation, I mean, consumer welfare is still key, but it has to be enriched. It has to consider innovation, it has to consider quality and even fairness. In a way, economic theory allows to consider even fairness within a typical, quite traditional concept of consumer welfare. Finally, the fourth, which is the outcome which allows to arrive at a sort of common policy recommendation. I mean, we realize that data acquisition, the profiling and personalization, pricing personalization, as again a double face, because I mean profilization, it could be extremely good from a commercial point of view, but if profilization how can I say, if profilization allow to profile consumers also for non-commercial reasons, I mean, we have round the corner there is Cambridge Analytica, so it is a completely different story. And you can have a list of the, let's say, typical questions, typical issues that we have when we deal with the digital economy. I have to stress also that it was quite clear, and in that case the convergence with the regulator was easier, that I mean, we are fully aware that market fails when pluralism is concerned. So there is a market failure that has to be addressed using regulatory tools. And in fact, I mean, the policy recommendations are the one that I are now showing with the slides. From some of them concern the institutional design, and as far as institutional design is concerned, I have to say that it was clear-cut for all of us, possibly because of a question of survival, that a digital agency is not necessary with a sufficient degree of cooperation, even if I stress that it is quite tiring, it's not always simple, but with a sufficient degree of cooperation, I mean, having data protection, consumer protection, and antitrust, I mean, you don't need to make them collapsing in a single agency. Also because, from my point of view, it's quite meaningless, because digital, it's a general purpose technology. So it means that the digital agency tomorrow will be the agency which is concerned with everything. I mean, the digital economy is like, I mean, the electricity in 1930. So now all the sectors, all the industry, all the markets are going to use data and digital tools in order to improve their productivity, their efficiency, so that it's meaningless to speak of digital markets. There is a digital economy, and the digital economy will be from the agricultural sector to the service sector, including the rest of the economy. I'd like to just to move to the other slide concerning policy recommendations, because I mean again, digital industry has to be an antitrust priority. It's quite clear. I mean, even the new European Commission stressed that digital will be one of the two priorities, the other one being the sustainability and the cooperation for environmental efforts. And there are some questions, some problems concerning merger control. the presentations before mine have already stressed that there is a problem of addressing two killer acquisitions. There is a problem of dealing with the, let's say, exclusion of potential competitors when they are extremely young. And this is true either for merger review and also for the application of as efficient test. I mean, Inge in her introduction stressed that we need to protect also not yet as efficient players, which doesn't mean not as efficient player, which is a completely different story. It could be also a goal of, or I don't know, social policy or whatever. But not yet as efficient is a very, very difficult task for antitrust, because applying in a dynamic way the as efficient test, the replicability test, I guarantee is not that easy. Not only because, I mean, the acquisition of relevant information is very difficult. And this is another crucial point when we have to deal with the digital economy. We have to strengthen the powers of information gathering. I mean, competition authorities cannot play the digital game without having more power in collecting relevant information, because the information asymmetry is extremely, extremely strong. I mean, I'm going to conclude my intervention just providing a broader picture of not only competition policy, saying some quite obvious statements. The first of one is, from my point of view, from our point of view, at least in the Italian Competition Authority, I could say that the traditional toolkit of the antitrust agencies is still largely appropriate. Because, I mean, the analytical issues, the analytical questions that we have to deal with, in theory, in principle, are quite old. I mean, let's say the trade-off between dynamic and static competition, the different forms of market power, the thin line which distinguishes explicit from implicit collusions, now emphasized by the role which could be played by artificial intelligence and algorithms. I mean, they are old stories that become quite new and quite more difficult to be addressed because of the speed of the change, the speed of innovation, the supranational dimension of the issues, and we have to take it in consideration. We have to keep them in mind. Additionally, I think that since it's very difficult to disentangle digitalization from globalization, I mean, it's quite clear that the pros and cons of the digital revolution are not equally divided. I mean, capital and mobile labor could seriously benefit from digitalization and globalization, whereas, I mean, unskilled or less skilled labor cannot benefit from, and there is a danger, there is a globalization and the digital economy are considered as sort of threat, so, and inequality matters. For these reasons, antitrust still plays a crucial role, but, and it is a very important but, needs a little help from her friends. So, and meaning, I mean, market-friendly public policies, which in a way are, from my point of view, let's say, an industrial policy which is consistent with antitrust, which is regulation, data protection, but also labor and welfare policy in order to accompany out of the market the losers, because again, competition is a harsh game and there are losers, there should be losers. Just yesterday in the OECD committee, they discussed a crucial issue, which is the barrier to exit, the social barrier to exit. Quite often, competition authorities could be shy to be extremely severe, to apply rigorously competition rules, because they are, let's say, pushed, they are afraid of the social impact, at least in the short run. If there, I mean, public policy which could make less costly the social impact of antitrust decision could be extremely useful if we like competition. If we don't like it, it's much better to have a defensive cartel or the Alitalia saga, an endless Alitalia saga. I mean, we have the examples under our eyes. And even insolvency policy could be extremely useful in order to allow what Schumpeter called an orderly retreat. And Schumpeter, I mean, is quite familiar with disruptive competition. I mean, it's a poor attempt to have a musical quotation, so with a little help from my friends, this is but I mean, it's absolutely miserable if compared with what Philip said before. But let me conclude with one final statement. Needless to say that even though the new challenges raised by algorithms and artificial intelligence are crucial, competition authorities shouldn't forget their traditional bread and butter, at least in Italy, because cartels in more traditional markets, bid rigging, or abuses in formally regulated industry have far from disappeared even in these interesting times. So I mean, now I am quoting an implicit quotation of Fred Geny. I really stole this slide from one of his presentations, but I think that this wish has to be underlined at the end of my intervention. Competition authorities and the Italian authority will just keep crashing if they never take their eyes off the rear view mirror. But, and this is my personal addition, especially for the female public, please stop looking at the rear window, but please do not forget the lipstick Chanel rouge.